There's been a change in philosophy in regards to military leadership. There is this growing trend among military commanders that states the modern military leader does not need to be in the trenches with the troops. This evolving idea of leadership separating itself from its subordinates has led to a complete disconnect of what success on the battlefield actually requires. We're going to take an in-depth look at this emerging philosophy through the published works of one of military's most respected leaders on this episode of The First Branch. I will admit, this will more than likely be one episode that gets me run out of town. I am going to take an honest and critical look at retired General McChrystal's book, Leaders, Myth and Reality. I know that, as a conservative American, I'm supposed to only say glorious and flowery words of praise to our military and its leaders. So sitting here dissecting Mr. McChrystal's ideas of leadership are not going to win me any points with the conservative movement. But that's okay. I'm not here to do what's popular. I'm here to do what's right. And this series is aimed at what's right for the military, not the Republican Party fan base. But before we dive into it, you know what I'm about to say. If loving your country, its military, and the Constitution are what you take pride in, heck, maybe you just like hearing another perspective. Then show your support for all things America by hitting that subscribe button, tapping that bell icon, and giving this episode a good old-fashioned American thumbs up. And don't forget to leave a comment. You know, if you write it, I'll read it. And in keeping with the idea that I'm never going to ask anything of someone else I'm unwilling to do myself, I have a special request. If I have served with you, or any of you that are watching, and I know I'm not perfect, so if there are any stories that you have that take me to task and hold me accountable, please don't be afraid to share it. If I'm going to hold McChrystal accountable for his ideas on leadership, I'm okay with any of our viewers doing the same to me. And who knows, maybe it'll jog my memory and a few more stories will come to light. We have a saying in the military, just give me the bottom line up front. We call this the bluff. When presenting information to commanders, we give them the end state first and then we work our way backwards. And that's what I'm going to do here tonight as well. And the bottom line up front here is, and make no mistake about it, I do not make this statement lightly. This is the absolute worst book on military leadership I have ever read. He absolutely draws nonsensical conclusions based solely on his own perspective and his relationship between his own actions and his perceived successes and failures. And throughout the rest of this episode, I'm going to show you, through McChrystal's own words, how he proves this statement to actually be a factual one. We are going to start by discussing, in his own words, not mine, the conclusions he has drawn. The myths he says proves his conclusions, and then we are going to examine his actions and show how his actions prove he behaves contradictory to what he actually writes in the book, all the while imploring modern military leadership to adopt his way of thinking. What I'm going to reveal right now, and I know this may come to a surprise to many of you, his thoughts and conclusions are not groundbreaking. The military has actually been leading this way for years, and that is why our commanders have not won a war since 1991. Now, do you remember that question I asked at the end of last week's episode? Who was the last general to win a war? Many of our military viewers will no doubt know the answer to this question, and that's General Norman Schwarzkopf. And the war he won was the Gulf War, also known as Operation Desert Storm, and that was back in 1991. There isn't an active duty commander in our military today that can say they have successfully led our military formations to victory. And that fact just blows me away. And why it is so difficult to wrap my mind around this fact is because our military leaders have had 20 years to win one. Yet there is no shortage of books of recently retired commanders that tells us how to successfully win in combat. Yet here we are, a nation still at war after 20 years. But don't worry, we're going to certainly address the concepts of leading an army in a war on terror versus a near-peer conflict, but that's going to be in a later episode. But in the meantime, let's get back to the task at hand. The conclusions McChrystal draws from his years of experience in combat are these. And again, I want to remind our audience, these are his words, not mine. And his words are these: leaders have a much less active or controlling role in today's combat environment. And in regards to a commander's vision on battlefield success, he makes this statement. And I seriously, it is hard for me to believe that he actually vocalized these words. And the degree of confidence he has when he says them is what is more telling. And his conclusion is this: leaders cannot produce these desired results. What makes this statement so shocking is that all battle plans are centered around the commander's vision and his end state. And here you have a commander saying out loud, I cannot affect the outcome. I mean, seriously, is this for real? He is flying in the face of over 200 years of successful battlefield military decision making. And commanders today are just eating this up. Why? How did we get to the point in our military where we ignore our past victories in favor of modern failures? And it is this question that this episode is going to answer. Because this line of thinking is unacceptable to anyone who believes we have the greatest military fighting force in the world. I mean, we have gone from back-to-back World War champions to a military believing it's a good thing to lead by emotionally inconsistent leadership who merely is just a conduit through which ideas are expressed. And yes, it was McChrystal who said that as well. These conclusions, McChrystal summarizes, are the reasons why the best our modern military commanders can be is enablers. It is here I want to restate what I said in the previous 2 episodes concerning leadership. A man who lacks motivation and the ability to fight thinks in a manner that is more in line with their state of being. This is why our grandpas should not be running our military. And I'm going to restate this at the end of our show, and I'm certainly going to state it again in many other episodes, but I'm not just referencing his age, while that still does remain a factor. And do you know what else is merely a conduit through which ideas are expressed? Any and all social media. That's right. One of our most revered modern commanders openly stated that the definition of modern military leadership is nothing more than the business model for social media. Welcome to the modern military age. And again, he's the one who said it, not me. So what are these all-important 3 myths that are going to revolutionize military command? Well, at least as described by McChrystal. Well, they're the formulaic myth, the myth of attribution, and the results myth. Now, my first assault of his assertions of these myths is simple. Well, these are not myths at all. Rather, they're truths. Truths that were validated when he hired a staff to help with research for his new book. Then, when it was discovered his actions were inconsistent with these truths, he set about changing the narrative. He was a 4-star commander who did not win a war that he was hired to win. And instead of behaving in a manner consistent with success, or having the courage to highlight where the organization needed to change, his failure forced him to create an academic language that would convince others that he was, in reality, a real success, all the while calling the behaviors that led him to failure myths. And now we're going to dissect each of these myths and compare them to his actions and results. And I'm going to start by using his own words against him. As he defines the formulaic myth, he challenges readers to look at the data of what characteristics successful leaders possess. Then he states that many leaders who strive to emulate these defined list of characteristics of effective leadership, well, they often fail. So let's look at the data, Mr. McChrystal. You are a 4-star general and the ISAF commander. Did you defeat the enemy? Nope. And everything you say and do now is to defend that data point. This book is the epitome of plausible deniability. With its publication, he is saying, I did everything the Army trained me to do, and I did not win. So it has to be the Army's fault. All the things they taught me must be wrong. What he never accounts for in his book is the fact that the values he was taught at the schoolhouse environment were abandoned for the optics of perceived success in the media. And that's no small observation. Our enemies actually account for this as part of their combat strategy. So there was no other conclusion that he could come to. Formulaic characteristics is a myth. Hey, I possess all the characteristics and didn't win, so having them must be unnecessary. And so how do I know he's wrong about this myth? Well, it's easy. There isn't a coach of a championship sports team that would ever say they wanted their players on their team that to not possess certain characteristics consistent with the team's culture. Not one. And I want to quote the late, great Herb Brooks here. I'm not looking for the best players. I'm looking for the right ones. In order for Brooks to have the confidence to make this statement, he needed to know three things: the vision of his team's concept and culture, the character of the team itself as a unit, and then he had to find the players who would fit best within the design. I mean, heck, all of the special programs in the military and how they operate, this is how they find people to fill their ranks. They do this through a rigorous selection process specific to meet the needs of their function. Navy SEALs don't go through SFAS, and vice versa. Air Force PJs don't go through civil affairs selection. I love the movie Miracle. There's a scene where Brooks is explaining to a group of administrators why all-star teams fail. Talent management is why. I'm sorry, Mr. McChrystal. You are wrong here. And the success of leaders before you and the success of leaders present prove it. Just because you failed doesn't mean you get to redefine what leadership is. Now, his second myth is the easiest to prove inconsistencies between his conclusions and his actions. He states that his actions had little to do with the outcome of his subordinates. He even states those he hired to do the research for his book discovered this fact. I mean, he was clueless. And he admits it. So imagine, you're a 4-star general and you hired a team to dissect your life as a commander. Then they discover through their research that you had little effect on the outcome of the units that you commanded. So now let's look back at an example from last week's episode. The one about Patton and how he shaped the narrative to invoke plausible deniability to distance himself from his own orders, which resulted in the murder of 72 prisoners of war. McChrystal is doing the exact same thing here. It was discovered he wasn't really in charge of his units, and he acknowledges this. I'll give him props for that. But he has spent the last 20 years fighting a war using plausible deniability to keep himself from being embarrassed as well as embarrassing the organization. By the time he and his team discover this truth, he has the ammunition ready to wage the war of the false narrative. And then he doubles down on the failure of command line of effort and writes a book calling for all military leadership to redefine what leadership is. Your Jedi mind tricks ain't gonna work on me. I was trained by the same people there, Mr. McChrystal. And so he redefines leadership by saying leadership today does not jump on a horse and lead with sabers ready. They are no longer needed to be down in the trenches anymore. Now, if you believe him, I want you to go to a pro sports team owner and tell them their head coach will no longer be attending practices. The players will still be required to show up, but their head coach will do all of his managing through virtual means. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? And yet that is exactly what McChrystal is describing for the future of our military. He has failed at leadership. Now remember, he has already admitted this. That is how he came to see all of these myths as myths. So don't get mad at me. So he's failed at leadership and has written a book to justify it, and people are soaking it up. But why should I be surprised? Over 1 million conservatives bought a book by Michael Knowles that had 300 pages in it and no words. I'm sorry. That was probably a bit unprofessional. I actually like Michael Knowles. He's my favorite pundit to listen to. But I couldn't resist taking a shot at poking the bear. And I do want to provide a more human example of how this myth of attribution is false. Now let's just say there's a couple and they have a child. I mean, the dad loves the child, but he hates being a dad. So for the sake of the home environment, he leaves. Because, I mean, who wants to raise a kid in a house of contention, right? Well, the child grows up and they become a success. The dad re-enters the picture and the child's naturally curious as to why the dad left in the first place. And so the dad responds to the inquiry by this. Well, despite everything, you turned out great. I mean, I can't take credit for the person you become, but hey, me not being there was certainly part of your success. I mean, this is not a stretch. It is a direct metaphor for what McChrystal is saying. Hey, I wasn't there to aid my subordinate commanders in their success. Therefore, I'm going to conclude commanders no longer have to be down in the trenches. I mean, does that even remotely sound correct? Remember, he's the one who wrote this. I hired the guys to help me discover my success, and the spotlight would be on me. This whole endeavor began from a point of hubris and optics. Then, the research didn't turn out the way he thought it would, and he discovered his command efforts were largely irrelevant. So then he writes a book to excuse his failures. Mr. McChrystal, you're an absentee father in a dysfunctional family. And I love the military way too much to let you get away with pushing this garbage as successful leadership. Now this brings us to the third and final myth. This is the results myth. He claims that historically we follow serial losers. And because of this, we actually follow leaders who are more emotional. It is in his failure to understand the relationship between success and results that has led him to this errant conclusion. He claims we, as a society, have drawn the incorrect conclusion that success and results are a one-for-one exchange in behavior. And no one anywhere has ever stated this. Well, I'm kind of being a bit dramatic here, I guess. I mean, I haven't read all the books, but I'm sure someone has said it somewhere. But no one I know, and certainly no military leader except him. So because of this errant conclusion, I see why he believes we follow serial failures. His conclusion also proves he equates struggle with failure. And why does he do this? Because struggle is the ugly part of life. It doesn't brief well. It's not good for the optics of an organization. And since modern command is driven by emotions and optics, those things that don't look pretty are failures. It's here I'm just going to mention the term PowerPoint. And those that know, they know what I'm talking about. So rather than seeing the struggles for what they are, stepping stones to eventual success, the ugliness of effort has been judged as failure. Keep your optics in your personal life. They don't belong in our military. I mean, nobody makes fun of a batter who has a 300 batting average. Why? Because even a 30% success rate, when viewed in context, can be seen as a success. And I got to thank my dad, William McMurray, for raising me with that bit of truth in my life. Props to my pops. But when your entire metrics for success is optics, any perceived deviation from the organizational norm is going to be considered a failure. And since optics is predicated on the emotion of the one in charge, what constitutes success can change from command to command. And this is the reason modern military commanders adopted the term acceptable levels of corruption. A term I know for a fact McChrystal used while he was in command. And how do I know this? Well, he went to West Point, or he was not allowed to lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those that do. Yet, as a commander in combat, he was responsible for rebuilding infrastructure. This required him to work with corrupt local businessmen as they bid for contracts. So he had to abandon that ethos for the sake of the organization. Well, as long as it didn't bring embarrassment to the organization. Because if he brought embarrassment to the organization, it might result in him being forced to resign or something. Does that sound familiar? It is the abandonment of quantifiable character qualities that has led commanders to the greatest failure of all. Failure to determine what results in success. I'm going to clarify this by way of an analogy. What would you think if NFL leadership decided that from now on, the only way a Super Bowl champion would be crowned was to not only win the actual Super Bowl game, but they would need to have a perfect season also? How many of you think that would be a fair metric of success? How many of you would actually watch a Super Bowl game if the two teams that went into the game had losses? That'd be like watching a Pro Bowl. That's what the Super Bowl would become. Yet, this is exactly how our political and military leaders qualify success in Afghanistan. They say we need to remain until complete peace has been achieved. But not just in Afghanistan, but for the entire Middle East. Because there are bad actors there and they need to be rooted out. I mean, heck, do we even have complete peace in our own country? What makes us think that we are ever going to achieve that in another? But our leadership needed a reason to stay. So what do? They created a measure of success they know can never be achieved, all for the purpose of giving us an excuse to maintain a presence, well, what really amounts to the occupation of a sovereign country. You see, McChrystal knows success will never be achieved in Afghanistan. And not because our service members on the ground can't win, but because our political and military leadership won't let them win. And since he's culpable in the protracted length of the war, he had to write a book excusing himself from this failure for the sole purpose of protecting his legacy. With the greater issue being the things he calls myths actually being truths. He even knows this. Just look at his LinkedIn page and any of his bylines. All of his social media bios point to the fact that he correlates these things he calls myths into building trust between him and his audience. Let me explain. Go to his LinkedIn, and you'll see him attributing his actions while in command to the desire to create trust between him and his audience for the expressed purpose of the results he can achieve. I mean, for crying out loud, he even has a picture of himself in his uniform with all of his medals on display. This is the very personification of, look at what I've done. Trust me because of my experience. But here's the thing. That's the way it should be. I agree with that. The issue is he just wrote a book that said all of that was a lie, and then turns around and does that very thing for the sole purpose of gaining trust. And here's what's funny. He has a team of people that are supposed to watch his every move to prevent this very thing from happening. And here's where I take the greatest exception to the conclusions McChrystal has drawn. Since modern warfare has changed, the military must adapt to the landscape. This is false. Discipline is still needed. Mastery of craft is still required. Values still drive decision-making, and vision focused on battlefield success is the only acceptable measure required to determine capability of military leadership. Failure to define achievable success, as well as failing to succeed on the battlefield, has led political and military leaders to determine that military leadership needs to be redefined. We don't need to redefine leadership. We need to get back to winning wars, then coming home with honor and victory. Stop using optics as the measure of military success. And in our next episode, I'm going to show you how, at each echelon of command, from the battalion level all the way up to the theater level of command, just how these ideas that McChrystal expressed in his book Leaders has infused themselves into the military decision-making process, as well as the net result these ideas have had with soldiers out on the battlefield. So until the next episode, have a great weekend, America, and God bless.